wonder, what's this red button do?
Dumb ways to die. So many dumb ways to die. Dumb ways to die. So many dumb ways to die.
Dress up like a moose during hunting season. Disturb a nest of wasps for no good reason. Stand on the edge of a train station platform. Drive around the boom gates at a level crossing. Run across the tracks between the platforms. They may not rhyme, but they're quite possibly the dumbest ways to die. The dumbest ways to die. The dumbest ways to die. So many dumb ways to die. Be safe around trains. A message from Metro.
All right. Thanks. All right, let's get started. So today we're resuming the kind of regular office hour schedule. So I'll be after class. I'll be, from as soon as I can get to William James Hall, I'll be in office hours from 4:15. I'm leaving a little early today, around 6:10. I think I mentioned last time that the midterms are being returned in section this coming week. I want to thank all the people in the Hasty Pudding who had me to their show yesterday, those of you in the class. That was my first Hasty Pudding show. It was very interesting. And that's it. All right, any questions on the material? By this point in the semester, you should all feel sufficiently relaxed to ask questions. Okay. Last time, we discussed different ways of conceiving of the causes of death, and with a particular emphasis on health behavior. So we are beginning a kind of a shift in thinking about what are the actual causes of illness and death in our society. And we focused on health behaviors, and we in particular focused on obesity. We discussed the patterning of obesity by race, sex, and income, and we talked about various determinants of obesity, including changing social norms. And finally, we began to discuss some policy interventions to address public health problems more generally, and there was a list that I blew by because we didn't have much time yesterday, but will be available on the slides when we upload the slides in a day or two for the last couple of lectures, a list of classes of policy interventions and levels at which those interventions might be directed that we began to discuss. And we began to talk a little bit about the use of the legal system, passing laws, and also this notion of counter-marketing, the kind of use of the tools of marketing to subvert what is ordinarily a commercial purpose to which those tools are traditionally deployed. And we'll be talking more about this. So today we're going to be talking about tobacco and to a lesser extent firearms, and I'm actually not going to be talking today about alcohol. I'll leave that to your conversation. Tobacco, as we saw the last time, is in fact, when seen in this way, is the leading killer in our society. 18% of Americans die from the consumption of tobacco, from diseases that are caused by the consumption of tobacco. And in fact, it's a leading killer despite the fact that cigarette consumption has been in fact declining since 1960. And the reason is that despite the decline in consumption, we are still nowhere near where we were in terms of tobacco consumption 100 years ago. So if you go back 100 years, Americans did not smoke. And here's the Great Depression where there's a dip, people can't afford cigarettes, and beginning in the 1930s, well, beginning early on, but certainly since the 1930s, there's this big swoop up, and especially during the Second World War, a lot of GIs, men start smoking before women. Same thing incidentally is happening in China. Right now, I think most Chinese men smoke, and like less than 2% of Chinese women. Many 12-year-old boys start smoking in China, but women are beginning to take off and begin to start smoking. Same kind of thing happened in the United States. The GIs start smoking, they come home, women start smoking, and around this time, scientists begin to become concerned that smoking can be causing cancer. And there's this very influential release in the 1960s of the first Surgeon General's report, which finally kind of makes the claim, tobacco could kill you, smoking causes lung cancer. Then a series of laws, a broadcast ad ban, the nation starts responding to this problem, non-smokers' rights movement begins, people saying, look, when I was a boy, incidentally, people would smoke everywhere, and it would be rude. If you told someone to quit smoking, that would be considered to be, you're weird to tell me to stop smoking. Whereas now, as non-smokers, it's considered weird and inappropriate of smokers to impose their smoke on us. And this in part was driven by the recognition that your behavior affects me, and it's this externality, it's this fact that smoking behavior in one individual has consequences for someone else, which captures a kind of American understanding of fairness. In fact, it captures an understanding of fairness that's been present since the Enlightenment, if not before, and says, look, your right to freedom stops when it reaches my nose, okay? You can move your hands however you want, but you can't punch me in the face. You can smoke, but if you exhale your smoke and I have to inhale it and it harms me, I can now regulate, I can pass laws that prevent you from smoking, and it's not just about protecting you from yourself, okay? There's an externality, there's a consequence of your action for others. So the non-smokers' right movement begins. It eventually becomes the key, most powerful factor in determining what happens with tobacco. Eventually they doubled the taxation rates, and a series of other developments. But the point is, even though tobacco smoking has been declining, we've only gone back to where we were in the 1950s. We're nowhere near where we were at baseline. And in fact, there's still 44 to 46 million Americans who are smokers in the United States, and among adults, the prevalence of tobacco consumption is 28%. And the average consumption is over 2,000 cigarettes per year, or about a third of a pack a day. And looking more closely at the period since 1991, and also looking at patterns by age, we see that there is a kind of recent decline, that this recent decline in tobacco consumption is not uniform across age groups. So if you look at the youngest age group, which is you guys, in your generation, actually tobacco consumption has been going up. So in the other age groups, there's been a kind of a gentle decline over the last 20 years. This just shows a 10-year period. But amongst young people, percent consuming cigarettes has been increasing. And in fact, among the young, those that are minorities and those that are of lower socioeconomic status are more likely to initiate smoking and are less likely to quit smoking. Well, why does tobacco kill you? Nicotine, which is the key addictive substance in tobacco, is a highly toxic substance in and of itself. Nicotine is a toxic thing, but actually tobacco has much more in it. Cigarette smoke has over 4,000 chemicals, and at least 50 of them are known carcinogens or harmful. Things like tar, cadmium, which is definitely not a good thing to have in you, lead, cyanide, you all know that for sure, nitrogen oxides, benzoate-pyrene, carbon monoxide, vinyl chloride, acetaldehyde, sodium hydroxide, and so forth. So sodium hydroxide, the caustic agent, is a constituent of tobacco smoke. And when you smoke, you put all that stuff right into your lungs and in immediate contact with your bloodstream. And this damages tissue throughout the body in several ways and affects multiple organs and increases the risk of cancer and many other diseases. And in fact, smoking and nicotine arouse strong physical and emotional reactions, feelings of pleasure, relaxation, alertness, and so forth. And in fact, it takes about, and I actually understood this because like I told you the other day, today I'm on day 32 of Diet Coke sobriety, and what's so fascinating to me is that my addiction to Diet Coke, I was drinking about 10 a day, and I've been doing that for like 20 years, was not just about the caffeine in the Diet Coke, but the whole ritual of getting the cold can, holding that cold can, hearing the click, of the little thing, seeing the do thing, and then the can there would be condensate on the can, so then as I picked it up, I would feel the kind of moisture on my hand, and then lifting it up occasionally as I'm writing. So when I'm writing on a book or working on a research paper, my Diet Coke consumption would skyrocket. And I tried doing experiments with myself. Like I would empty the cans and I put ice water in them, but then I wouldn't have the click sound and I wouldn't have the condensate. So it was literally like the whole experience. It wasn't just the caffeine, it was the whole experience. And the same thing happens with smoking. It's not just a physical addiction, it's a kind of emotional or psychological addiction as well. So, and it arouses the smoking behavior, and the nicotine arouse strong physical and emotional reactions. And what's interesting is they can both make you more relaxed and make you more alert, somehow at the same time, which is a little weird. And in fact, it takes just 10 to 19 seconds for the nicotine in a cigarette to reach the brain from when you start smoking and stimulate the release of neurotransmitters. And a rapid behavioral reinforcement enhances this addiction. So nicotine causes the release of serotonin, dopamine, norepinephrine, and leads to neuroadaptation. You get used to having nicotine in your bloodstream. It's like going through caffeine withdrawal, going through nicotine withdrawal. And then each year, about 70% of Americans, 70% of people who are smokers want to stop smoking. So if you talk to smokers, they want to stop. And each year, nearly 35 million people make a concerted effort to quit smoking, and yet less than 7% stay smoke-free for a year, and most start smoking again within days. 40% of heart attack smokers relapse while still in the hospital within 2 days of intensive care. So you're a smoker, you have a heart attack, you're in the intensive care unit, you know that your smoking has contributed to this heart attack, and here you are in the ICU and you could have died, so you should be really powerfully motivated to quit, and yet you're unable to. Nearly half of them start smoking again, even while they're still in the hospital. 50% of patients with laryngectomies try smoking. Laryngectomies is when I remove you have cancer in your larynx, and I remove your voice box and you can't speak. And I don't know if you've ever seen people, they hold that vibrating thing, or it goes like this, and they talk in this crazy voice, like, you know. And we joke when I was in medical school, but it's true. When I got to my house officer training, when I was at the Veterans Administration Hospital in the University of Pennsylvania, these guys at the vet, they would ask us, and we would obligingly wheel them outside, and they'd be smoking through their trach tube, their laryngectomy. They would be putting a cigarette here in the hole in their neck to smoke through that, even after they'd had their larynx removed from cancer from tobacco. 50% of patients with a lung removed for lung cancer smoke again. I don't know if you've had none of you have probably had a pneumonectomy, obviously, but if you've even thought about a pneumonectomy, that is a big deal. And removing a lung, and even after the removal of a lung, people will start smoking again. And more than half of heroin and cocaine users and alcoholics rate smoking harder to quit. People who use heroin and cocaine say it's easier to quit heroin and cocaine than it is to quit smoking. Nicotine is incredibly addictive. And in fact, what happens in the process of neuroadaptation is that the brain develops more nicotine receptors, and so requires increasing amounts of nicotine to achieve the same effects. And the constant amount of nicotine seems to give less and less of a rush. The brain gets used to nicotine, and it needs it in order to function normally. And anyone who's gone through caffeine withdrawal knows what that's like. And in fact, it's really, really hard to quit smoking, even after getting, as I just said, a substantial health shock. Well, how addictive is nicotine? This slide shows some results of a study of the subjective and physiological effects of intravenously administered cocaine and nicotine. So we take subjects, we bring them into the lab, and we are going to intravenously inject cocaine into them or nicotine into them. And lest any of you be thinking that that would be a cool study to enroll in, what we are going to do is we're going to take people who are already cocaine abusers and nicotine users so we can get it a bit more ethical. So we're going to take 10 of these individuals, and under double-blind conditions, they're going to either receive placebo or cocaine at 3 different doses or nicotine at 3 different doses in a mixed order. And we're going to measure physiological and subjective data before and after this intravenous administration. And compared to 3 doses of cocaine and nicotine given in this IV double-blind study with a saline placebo, the nicotine high and rush were rated as stronger than cocaine, though nicotine also these people thought made you more jittery. Nicotine had a more rapid onset of subjective effects, and it was frequently misidentified as intravenous cocaine by these individuals. It is a delicious drug. People really like it. And you begin to see why it's so hard for people to quit and why once they use it, they can't. Now, the tobacco companies were explicitly aware of this addictive properties of nicotine and of the efficiency of cigarettes in delivering them. And as a result of lawsuits launched against the tobacco companies in the 1990s, an enormous trove of internal industry documents was released, as outlined in Professor Brandt's wonderful book, The Cigarette Century. Thus, we now have access to numerous internal company documents. And here, for example, is a comment from those documents from 1972 by William Dunn at Philip Morris. The cigarette should be conceived not as a product, but as a package. The product is nicotine. Think of the cigarette pack as a storage container for a day's supply of nicotine. Think of the cigarette as the dispenser for a dose unit of nicotine. Smoke is beyond question the most optimized vehicle of nicotine, and the cigarette the most optimized dispenser of smoke. This is from another document. To account for the fact that the beginner smoker will not tolerate the unpleasantness, we must invoke a psychosocial motive. Smoking a cigarette for the beginner is a symbolic act. The smoker is telling the world, this is the kind of person I am. Surely there are variants of this theme. I am no longer my mother's child. I am tough. I am not a square. That's old slang. Unlike saying like that something is mad diesel, this is old slang. Whatever the individual intent, the act of smoking remains a symbolic declaration of personal identity. And in fact, indeed, the tobacco companies have become experts on the psychosocial aspect of growing up, since so much of their business is bound up in understanding how to motivate young people to start smoking. They had whole shops of researchers and other people who were studying adolescent psychology in order to understand how do we get people to start smoking, because once they start, we know they're hooked, they'll be addicted by this powerful nicotine, and they won't be able to stop. And they understood that young smokers soon get addicted to nicotine. Here's another industry document. As the force from the psychosocial symbolism subsides, the pharmacological effect takes over to sustain the habit. It's really shocking, isn't it, to read this very nonchalant way from the 1960s, these documents just describe the very deliberate intent to addict millions of people, a whole nation, with this substance. Now, we care about tobacco not only because it kills its users, but also because it kills, quote, innocent bystanders. And similar phenomena obtained with other behavioral causes of death, such as accidents or alcohol use or sexual behaviors. And we're going to be talking about those later in the course. But in terms of secondhand, in fact, when I was a house officer, I didn't tell you this earlier, but when I was a house officer, like the first week I was a house officer at the University of Pennsylvania, I had an experienced resident, stop me if I told you this story, I had an experienced resident who took me aside, and I was in the emergency room that first month, and we had 13 beds on one end, with one room was for psychiatric patients, and we had a lot of patients with sort of sexually transmitted diseases who typically filled up 7 of those 12 beds, and then we had other beds over here, and then the trauma bay in the back. And he said to me, Nicholas, he said, 80% of the people that come to the emergency room are coming because of poor choice of partners. So they're coming here for sexually transmitted diseases, they've been driven to drink by their partners, they're victims of domestic assault, they're smoking because they're inhaling secondhand smoke of their partners, they're victims of motor vehicle accidents, and so forth. So secondhand smoke, being the victim of someone else's actions, is not a trivial phenomenon. Secondhand smoke, inhaling other people's smoke, has been classified as a carcinogen since 1993. It contains, as we already said, over 4,000 chemicals, 50 known carcinogens. 60% of non-smokers in the United States have biological evidence of secondhand smoke exposure. And this secondhand smoke exposure itself causes 3,000 lung cancer deaths and 35,000 heart disease deaths per year. 35,000 people in our country, it is estimated, die every year from inhaling the smoke that other people have exhaled. There are also 8,000 to 26,000 new asthma cases in children every year, 150,000 to 300,000 bronchitis, pneumonia cases in babies. This is not amongst the smokers. This is amongst other non-smokers. And in fact, 2 hours spent in a smoky bar is equivalent to smoking 4 cigarettes. So if you go into a place where there are lots of smokers in a confined environment, just inhaling the air around you is equivalent to smoking yourself. And as I already alluded to, these observations were critical in the movement against tobacco. Because smoking imposes these externalities, these external effects on other people, these externalities were useful motivators to regulation. And these externalities are not obviously present in the case of obesity. But should they become present, or should the public perception be that someone else's body size affects me, I think that there could be a shift in our society and our attitudes towards obesity. Because right now we think people, even though from a public health point of view we might be very concerned about people gaining weight, rightly so in my judgment, we don't have a good sort of ethical basis for compelling them not to do so. We might want to change the structure around them to help them do what's good for themselves, but we don't have a compelling motivation to compel them. But if we come to see obesity as imposing these externalities that we do smoking, we may shift our attitude on this topic as well. So these externalities were powerful bases for prompting the emergence of regulation in our society over the last few decades. But the addictive properties of cigarettes and the issue of the harmfulness of consuming secondhand smoke, both of these things were key facts that motivated a public health response to smoking, focusing on the structure and not the agency. So we say, look, we cannot rely on people's agency, their own actions, their own choices in this situation for two reasons. First, it's addictive. They can't help themselves, right? It would be like telling someone that's on cocaine, snap out of it, just stop. Right? We say it's really addictive. And second, we can't just say, oh, well, let people decide what they want to do for themselves when it comes to smoking, because their actions are harming us. So we have a right to intervene and do something about it. Well, what are some of the ways to respond to this menace at the population level? How can we address the structure of the problem and not just the agency involved, especially if addiction is compromising this agency? How can we do this, especially given the collective and not just individual risks that the behavior imposes? Well, there are a variety of strategies. Taxation, you can tax cigarettes, which makes people less likely to use it. Counter-marketing, you can begin to deploy some ideas that are very, rife in marketing strategies to get people to stop or quit or not start. You can have pass laws that regarding clean indoor air, restricting the venues where it's legitimate to smoke. And you can subsidize or provide smoking cessation programs in a variety of ways that allows people or helps people to avail themselves of the best available technology if they wish to quit smoking. So first, let's talk a little bit about, we're going to talk about all four of those things. Let's talk a little bit about the first one, which is the cost of buying a cigarette. In fact, a large part of the cost is taxes. So focus just on the red line here. The rate of, and this is the real excise tax rate in the United States since 1950 to 2000. So this is like the, what taxes were high, and then they kind of fell in the 1980s, and they've been rising again. And the rate of cigarette taxes vary greatly, from about 2.5 cents per pack in Kentucky to over $2 a pack in New Jersey. And in 2004, these are outdated statistics, the national average was about 66 cents a pack. It's surely double that now. And some municipalities add further taxes. So for example, a pack of cigarettes purchased in New York City, who knows what a pack of cigarettes costs in New York City? Yeah, about $10, so $8 to $10. And overall, however, cigarette taxes are still not at historical highs. So even though now we have taxes pretty high, they're not anywhere near as high as they were in the 1970s. They went down, they've gone up, but not as high as they could be or have been in the past. And it turns out that numerous economic studies have documented that the purchasers of cigarettes are very sensitive to the price. Every 10% increase in the price of cigarettes results in a 4% decrease in the use of cigarettes. And this gives us a very effective public health lever with which to affect behavioral change. We could tax the bejesus out of cigarettes, and we know that so doing will decrease the use of tobacco. Here are some results from a specific study looking at the effects of taxes on the smoking cessation habits of pregnant women. So we say, let's take a group of people, women who are pregnant, who should be, we think, powerfully motivated to want to quit, if not for their own sake, for the sake of their baby. And ask the question, how this population, which we think is primed to be sensitive, how effective are taxation in reducing the consumption of tobacco? And we know that prenatal and postnatal smoking has significant detrimental effects on children's health. In fact, prenatal smoking accounts for 20% of low birth weight babies and is the most important modifiable risk factor for poor pregnancy outcomes. And postnatal smoking doubles the risk of sudden infant death syndrome and is a major risk factor for respiratory illness, middle ear problems, and asthma in children. This figure compares the prenatal quit rate for women in New York and Washington state, where cigarette taxes were raised early in the sample period, to the quit rate for women in 6 states that did not raise their taxes. And so as the figure illustrates, the quit rate in the 2 affected states rose by approximately 15 percentage points between 1994 and 1996, while the quit rate for the unaffected states remained relatively constant. So the study asks, how able are women to quit smoking when they're pregnant in 6 states where nothing is going on with the taxes? And here is the non-tax changing states across time. So every year we look at women and say, women who are pregnant this year in this state, are they able to quit? Women who are pregnant in this year in this state, are they able to quit? And on balance, about 40% of these women are able to quit in any given year. But in New York and Washington, where taxes were raised during this period, we go from this lower rate and it rises afterwards. And this NBR working paper does some statistical analyses I won't go into to confirm that actually there's an identifiable effect of taxation on getting women to be able to quit. And next, these authors directly estimate the effect of cigarette taxes on quit rates using the same changes in state cigarette taxes to identify the effects. And they find that a 10% increase in cigarette taxes increases the probability of a woman quitting smoking during pregnancy by 10%. And this rate is higher than the rate I alluded to a minute ago when I said 10% increase in taxes results in a 4% increase in quitting. Why do you think it might be higher here? Yeah, motivation, exactly. These women, they have some agency as well, right? It's not just structure. They have some, they're really powerfully motivated, these women, to quit, so they're more sensitive to a price change than non-pregnant women might be. Plus, the other beautiful thing here is that two people benefit, both the mom and the baby, right? So we get double the benefit, double the return on our investment from the taxation. And in fact, the authors estimate that a 30-cent increase in taxes would have had approximately the same effect on quit rates as enrolling women in a prenatal smoking cessation program. So actually, a broad policy that's very easy to implement. We don't have to have people working in the field and trying hard. Just taxing cigarettes will have this big effect. So taxes work very well, actually, at reducing the consumption of tobacco because people are motivated by money. Unfortunately, they're also motivated by sex. And the tobacco industry has a long history of using it to sell cigarettes. So the Camel's goal of trend-influence marketing is to attract and convert smokers in the trend-setting urban scene. And this will have a lasting impact on clubgoers who will begin to associate Camel with what is cool. And they have a long history of using attractive individuals, often women, to promote the use of their products. And here's some ads targeted at young women. Smoking is portrayed as, slow down, pleasure up. Virginia Slims, if I ran the world, calories wouldn't count. And until I find a real man, I'll take a real smoke. And smoking is seen as a way to get a man, a way to get thin, even while eating French fries, or to replace a man, even, on the far right. And these ads are, marketed towards young people, sort of trying to meet them, where they care most about. These ads are also presumably targeted at young women, and even the girl in the dragon tattoo is foreseen, it looks like. And these ads are targeted at men, though it's unclear whether guys are such dopes that they'd really fall for this stuff. Here's an old ad. Pall Mall Gold on hundreds, filters farther for a milder smoke. They're seeming to compare the size of this cigarette here. Camel has pleasure to burn. This one is one of my favorites. Blow in her face and she'll follow you anywhere. So apparently these were very effective ads, both for the men and for the women. Because you guys, people your age, fell for this stuff. And in fact, here is, all of you probably know this character. This is Joe Cool. There was a study that was, Joe Camel rather, there was a study that was published in JAMA a few years ago that found that 4-year-olds were just as able to identify Joe Camel as Mickey Mouse. I mean, Joe Camel was so widely prevalent. In fact, I should add that for next time I teach the class. So widely prevalent that people could pick out Joe Camel. And he's allegedly a very cool guy. This is not my brand of cool, but this is not Mad Diesel. But it meets someone. And other people, there's been an elaborate analysis of the phallic symbolism in Joe Camel, with the penis and the testicles here. Although it's unspecified what the cigarette is doing there. But I'm not kidding you. There's been an elaborate sort of deconstruction of this iconography, treating cigarette ads in a kind of iconographic fashion. Now, counter-marketing seeks to use these tools seeks to use marketing tools like sex and humor to make smoking not more, but less desirable. And we saw a bit of this the last time with respect to obesity. Here are just a few examples with respect to smoking, starting with a famous character, Joe Camel, who can be converted to Joe Chemo. And here, poor Joe Chemo, has become more flaccid. He's taken off the sunglasses. Here he is, and he's emaciated, and he's no longer happy. Or you can say, smoking can reduce blood flow and cause impotence. And it says smoking may reduce blood flow and cause impotence, again, playing on the whole phallic iconography. That's obvious. They don't put the Marlboro brand there, but again, that's implied and is obvious. Or you can take advantage of the health externalities of secondhand smoke. Here, this smiling bride, has a little knife in her chest. Women married to a smoker have a 91% greater risk of heart disease, no longer the happy bride. Or you can begin to do other things like, to make your cat stop undesirable behavior, squirt a water pistol firmly saying no. So bad cat, you've got a bad habit, let's sort of use some humor. You didn't laugh, but some humor in trying to get people to think differently about tobacco consumption. Or other kinds of sort of street art, which I find very inventive. I love this kind of performance art or on display or some of these flash mobs or other kinds of very interesting things. Lately, I've been seeing this video of this woman who danced like no one's watching. Do you know this thing? Some of you don't know this? I just found it, so I can't believe if you guys didn't see it before me. But anyway, so here's an example of someone who took a sewer and, painted a mouth and a cigarette to just make it clear that, smoking is disgusting like a sewer. Or here's another example. I'll just let you watch this one. Pay attention.
Ladies and gentlemen, step right up. Welcome to our show. This is sodium hydroxide. Sodium hydroxide is a caustic chemical found in hair removal products. But you know what? It's also found in something else. Yeah, that can't be good for you.
Do you want to see that again? Did you get that? You want to see it again? Raise your hands if you want to see it again. All right, let's play it again.
Ladies and gentlemen,
I know this is the part you love the most. There you go.
This is sodium hydroxide. Sodium hydroxide is a caustic chemical found in hair removal products. But you know what? It's also found in something else.
Cigarettes, right? Very fast.
Yeah, that can't be good for you.
Actually, this website, thetruth.com, is phenomenal. It has you know about it, some of you do, has an incredible series of sort of counter-marketing ads like this. I won't tell you about some of the others, but you should just go have a look. They're very creative and very powerful, actually. I bet many of you will remember this image of, these men having their hair removed, and others of the images that I've shown you today. Okay, now let's take a look at some of the laws prohibiting indoor smoking. These laws were driven, again, by the phenomenon of secondhand tobacco exposure and the illnesses arising from it. And over the last 20 years or so, more and more states have passed comprehensive clean indoor air laws, prohibiting smoking in virtually all public and private workplaces throughout the state, including restaurants, bars, and hotels. And clear indoor air laws should cover, I think, or often do cover, all public places, with a special emphasis on healthcare institutions, schools, daycare centers, and the like. And all schools and children's facilities that receive federal aid have been smoke-free since 1995. And these laws have been shown to be highly effective. They reduce smoking prevalence by between 5 and 10%. 26.4% of smokers who worked in communities with strong ordinances quit smoking within a 6-month period, compared to 19.1% of those in areas with no such ordinance. And a smoking ban, another study looked at a smoking ban in Helena, Montana, and it found that it produced a 40% decrease in hospital admissions for acute myocardial infarction, heart attacks, over a 6-month period. So these laws work. People quit smoking when you make it very difficult for them to find an environment in which they can do so. Finally, let's turn to some techniques that can be used on individual patients. So we've talked about laws, counter-marketing, taxes, and now we're going to look at sort of some direct interventions that are targeted at individuals. We saw earlier that of the 46 million smokers in the United States, 70% would actually like to quit. But in fact, each year, less than 5% are able to do so without assistance. And it turns out the odds of successful quitting can be increased, doubled, or even tripled by a number of interventions. So how can we get these people who wish to quit, how can we help them quit? Well, there are counseling interventions, nicotine replacement, like chewing the gum. Nicotine gum can be very helpful. Different kinds of drugs, and also quit lines, little sort of services that are now online. There are online programs you can use like QuitNet, and also in the olden days there were phone numbers you could call. When you had the urge to smoke, you could call and speak to a human being, and they would help you stay sober. Counseling can be extremely effective, especially if financial incentives are applied. For example, one study showed that providing financial incentives of up to $750 increased quit rates at 1 year from 5% to nearly 15%. So you offer someone $750 to not smoke for a year, and you can really dramatically increase the probability that they'll succeed. And that's a bargain, actually, in terms of cost savings for the individual and for the society. And you can make sure they're not cheating because you can do blood tests and see whether they have products that reflect smoking in their bloodstream. So it's really easy to enforce. You don't have to worry that people are lying to you. And nicotine replacement is available in an amazing variety of forms: gum, lozenges, patches, inhalers, nasal spray. Quit lines are also quite cheap and have a high marginal return, and they're increasingly high-tech internet equivalents, and online support is also increasingly available. Now, unfortunately, insurance coverage for such interventions is patchy at best, but at least at the federal level, it's not bad. And since March of 2005, Medicare, which is healthcare coverage for the elderly, has covered tobacco cessation counseling, and since January of 2006, it's also covered prescription drugs such as nicotine nasal spray and bupropion, which are helpful in helping people to control their urges. Here's another recent online tool that was founded by a couple of economists at Yale. It's called Stick, S-T-I-C-K-K, and I think their tagline, this is an old screen grab of their website, it was like, take a contract out on yourself. And this thing, I may bungle the story, but the gist of the story is these two guys were working at MIT, I think, down the hall from each other, and they both wanted to achieve some objective. I think they wanted to run or lose weight. And they agreed, they contracted among themselves that they would pay each other $5,000 if they didn't honor the commitment that they made to each other today to run every day or whatever it was. So David and I make a contract. We agree to run every day. If he runs and I don't, I give him $5,000. If I run and he doesn't, he gives me $5,000. And if we both run, neither of us pays the other guy. And they found this to be very effective at motivating their own behavior. Very high, large sum of money that was did. And so these guys have developed a website now where you can make a contract with yourself to do something, and they have different ways where you would appoint individuals. The way they do it, though, is you give them some money, and then you pick a number of vile places to which this money could be given that you don't agree with, like the KKK or the Nazi Party or whatever it is. And then they have your money, and then you appoint a friend. This was the old way. I don't know if they're still doing this way. You have a friend of yours who has the power to say, you know, you didn't quit smoking. That contribution you made, it's going to this organization. And they pick a whole spectrum of political organizations, so there's something vile for everyone on their website that you could pick. So now I'd like to make a few remarks about firearms and public health. Firearm homicide rates, and this is actually, given what happened in Newtown recently, very sort of timely topic. Unfortunately, it's timely every year that I give this class. Firearm homicide rates for young men in the United States are between 12 and 273 times the rates of other industrialized countries. And this is the case even though non-firearm homicide rates are only between 1.4 and 9.2 times greater than other countries. So why is this difference important? So this shows the mechanism of homicides amongst 15 to 24-year-olds in diverse countries: Canada, England, France, Israel, Norway, Scotland, and here's the United States. And the light blue is the firearm portion, then this is the cutting or piercing portion, and this is, the candlestick and the rope and the other things over here. So why is the difference? What is interesting about these data? What can we conclude from these data? So let me restate the facts. We have between 12 and 300 times the rate of killing each other with guns in our society, but do not differ or have as much as 10 times the rate of killing each other without guns compared to other countries. So what might this suggest to you just as a first pass? Yeah.
Guns might change people's ability to harm each other very rapidly, or their motivation, because they don't have to stop and think or engage in the act of stabbing, which is hard.
Yes, that's right. That's exactly right. So guns, the argument here is that the availability of guns, this structural feature in our society, is making us more murderous. And data like this is kind of inescapable in that regard, right? We're not becoming more murderous with ropes and candlesticks and knives and poisons. We don't poison each other at a greater rate. We don't hang each other at a greater rate. We kill each other with guns at a greater rate. And these other countries, with the exception of Israel, which is an interesting case, do not have, in Israel, there are people with machine guns everywhere, do not have the same rates of killing each other in that situation. And in fact, guns have not replaced other violence, and the United States is only slightly intrinsically more violent than some of these other societies. So one of the arguments that's often made with respect to gun control is that, well, if you don't give people guns, they'll kill each other some other way. That's not true, actually. Guns make it much easier to kill people. On the day that Newtown took place, the same day when he went in and he killed over 20 kids with his submachine gun, semi-automatic weapon, there was a man in China who, with an axe, attacked a preschool. And he injured 20 kids, same number approximately of kids, but not a single one died. Well, it's obvious why, right? It's much harder to kill people with a knife or an axe than a gun, and you can outrun those things, or you can do something about it, whereas you can't with a gun. And the Kellerman study from your readings today gives you a feel for the frequency and age and race distribution of not just deaths, but more broadly, injuries due to firearms in the United States. This study defined an injury as resulting from the discharge of a firearm, defined an injury as something that took as its outcome injuries that resulted from a firearm being discharged and that made someone go to an emergency room. And overall, in the 3 cities studied, which were Seattle, Memphis, and Galveston, Texas, there were between 110 and 160 injuries due to firearms per 100,000 people per year, or somewhat over 1 per 1,000 people per year. And 88% of the injuries occurred during an assault, 7% during suicide attempts, and only 4% were unintentional injuries. And overall, 19% of the injuries were fatal. But look at the variation by age and race and ethnicity. So this shows firearm-related injuries in 3 cities according to age, race, or ethnic group. So here is the age range, for example, 15 to 29-year-olds. Here, non-Hispanic whites, men are much more likely than women to be injured by guns, cases per 100,000 years. Look at African-American males and females. 1,708 out of 100,000. So almost 2 out of 100 African-American males in this population, in this age, were likely to be injured by a gun per year in this data set. Again, black men more than black women. Here, Hispanic men and women as well. And men obviously are more violent than women, but they're also the victims of more violence. And there's a peak in the youthful age range. By the time people get to be older, no one is shooting each other anymore in my age bracket. It's your age bracket that's vulnerable to this type of behavior. And the burden on minority populations is enormous, right? I mean, you can't help but look at something like that and be stunned by it. So we have large numbers of people who are using weapons and dying from the use of weapons in this subset of our population. And numerous epidemiological studies of diverse designs have confirmed, and there is some debate in the scientific literature about this, but I think a fair reading of the total literature is that actually increased availability of guns increases killing. I don't think the sort of NRA line that guns don't kill people kill people, actually comports with anything we know in the social sciences with respect to structure versus agency, right? You make the country awash in weapons, people use these weapons. A fight between partners that would have just been a slap or a bad words results in an accidental discharge, or you point the gun, you shoot someone. Actually, there's studies. If I brought you guys into the laboratory and handed you what looked like a real gun, like that felt like a real gun, and then I asked you to do various tasks, your sense of power and anger would be increased just by holding this weapon, right? So your response to what would be considered to be, slights that you otherwise might ignore is modified by the presence of a gun in your hand. So another way that the guns change us is by changing our psychological response to the things that we face. So numerous studies of diverse designs confirm that gun availability increases successful suicides and homicides, and hence death. This slide shows rates of household firearm ownership and rates of suicide, firearm suicide, and non-firearm suicide across 7 Northeast states in this time period. So here's the percent here by all these states, Vermont, Maine, New Hampshire, and so forth, the percent of households with firearms, the suicides per 100,000, the firearm suicides per 100,000, and the non-firearm suicides. And once again, we see the same pattern. The non-firearm suicides, roughly constant across all these states, right? But the firearm suicides are much higher in states that have a widespread ownership of guns than not. Because if you're of a mind to kill yourself, it's much easier to kill yourself with a gun. The availability of a gun changes not only your probability of attempting to kill yourself, but the success of your killing yourself. So the presence of these weapons in our midst affects our actions and harms, in my judgment, our public health. Now, it should be possible to treat guns as a threat to public safety and to regulate them. And there would appear to be wide support for this, depending on how the question is phrased. Most gun owners understand that guns are dangerous and know how to properly use and store weapons. And the great majority of gun owners are actually in favor of reasonable laws that we would pass to prevent the killing by guns in our society, whether it's restricting the purchase or the type of ammunition, taxing ammunition, whether it's having registries, background checks or records kept about who's buying a gun and why, and so forth. So support among respondents for the regulation of guns as consumer products, this is percent who favored or strongly favored a policy by all respondents and by the respondents who hold guns. So governmental regulation of gun design, everyone thinks that that's reasonable, or not everyone, a majority thinks that's reasonable. Same standards for domestic guns as for imported guns, everyone thinks that that's a good idea. Why should we have different standards for domestically produced guns than for foreign guns? Child-proofing of all new handguns. So every year kids find daddy's gun. I don't understand why dad doesn't go to jail when that happens, by the way. Why? Or if you go into a neighbor's house and find an unsecured firearm, why that owner isn't held responsible. Somehow we see the 5-year-old who took it to school and shot his friend, as he is seen as having agency, but the person who leaves the unsecured firearm is somehow not. So we could child-proof handguns. Adults would still be able to use them. We child-proof pill bottles, for the love of God, in our society. Why can't we child-proof guns? I don't understand. We can personalize guns. So only the authorized person, we have the technology to do that. Even a simple majority of gun owners think that that's a good idea. Magazine safety for all new pistols, loaded chamber indicator for all new handguns, again. So these are all reasonable policies that both gun owners and non-gun owners actually agree to. And the success in the United States in reducing motor vehicle injuries, we now have one of the lowest rates of death per vehicle mile in the world, provides some insight into the methods that we could use to reduce firearm injuries. So over the last 40 years, especially even over the last 20 years, since you guys have grown up, our nation has undergone this incredible transformation in how we have coped with the problem of motor vehicle fatalities in our midst. And we can learn some lessons from that if we want to reduce the burden of gun fatalities in our midst. In the 1950s, efforts to reduce motor vehicle injuries focused on the driver and the agency of the driver. And the data were interpreted to suggest that almost all automobile crashes were caused by an error on the driver's part. This now harkens back also to the iatrogenesis thing that we were talking about. Where is the source of the mistake when a driver has an accident and kills himself or someone else? And at that time, the greatest attention was paid to education and enforcement, training motorists to drive better and punishing them for committing safety violations. But eventually, injury control experts recognized that to increase the safety of driving, it would be more cost-effective to try to change the vehicle and the highway environment than to try to change human behavior. And there was a shift in the focus from agency to structure. Thus, numerous alterations were made, both in cars and in roads, to make collisions less likely, better brakes, or divided highways. When I was a boy, 2 lanes would go in one direction and 2 lanes in the other direction. There was no divider between them. Very easy to drive into oncoming traffic. Most of you probably haven't seen a highway like that. Highways are divided. Traffic going in opposite direction, far apart from each other. Other types of things interventions were made to make serious injuries more avoidable if there was a collision. So we have collapsible steering columns, non-rupturable gas tanks, breakaway road signs, putting a little a break in the bottom of a road sign, so if you run into the road sign gives way instead of being a rigid object into which you can collide. More advanced emergency medical systems, and so on. Nobody believes that today's drivers are more careful than those of the 1950s, yet the number of motor vehicle fatalities per mile has been reduced by more than 75%. In fact, firearms, like motor vehicles, lawnmowers, and chainsaws, are consumer products that might cause an injury. And the safety of virtually every consumer product is regulated by federal or state government. The conspicuous exception is the gun. And unfortunately, as Hemingway points out in your readings, because firearms have been deliberately exempted from the oversight of the Consumer Product Safety Commission, we are in the indefensible position of having stronger consumer protection standards for toy guns, and actually even for teddy bears, than for real guns. We regulate the manufacture of toy plastic weapons much more than we do real guns. Now, for those of you that are thinking to yourselves, well, we have the Second Amendment, ask yourself this. We make so many trade-offs in our fundamental rights, even if you grant that gun ownership is a fundamental right, which I think is crazy, but let's say you grant it. We constantly weigh, right to free speech, and then we say, well, we're going to draw limits on pornography, or we don't want kids to have access to porn, or we say, rights to peaceably assemble, yes, but you can't riot. We draw constraints, we often balance rights and responsibilities. And in the case of a gun, there are externalities. People aren't just shooting themselves, they're shooting other people. So, how can we affect public health change in general, not just now with obesity, tobacco, and guns? What is a useful way to modify structure so that we can change individual behaviors? This is a cartoon of how water was drawn for use in many households in London in the mid-19th century. And this is a very, very famous, one of the most famous pieces of data analysis, which was performed by John Snow in the mid-19th century. At the time, there was an outbreak of cholera which occurred in the Soho district of London, in and around Broad Street in 1954. And some elements of the story I'm about to tell you are disputed, but I'm going to tell you the conventional version. John Snow reasoned that if cholera was spread by a mist or a miasma, so people would get diarrheal disease in London, and some people thought something was floating through the air and was making people sick in different parts of London. He reasoned that if it was spread by a mist, as then prevailing theory suggested, the cases should be uniformly distributed along streets. And to see if this was the case, he plotted, in an early sort of big data visualization, he plotted each cholera case on a map. And as can be seen, so here's the area in and around the Broad Street. Here's Broad Street, and here's a pump on Broad Street, and here are other pumps in these little round dots. Here's a pump, and there's a pump, and there's a pump. And each of these little stacks indicates a case of cholera. And look at all these cases here, and there, and there, and there, and there, and there, and there. There are all these cases. And he plotted these cases where they occurred on a map, and he found that they were clustered right around the Broad Street pump. And he went to the pump and he took a water sample and he looked at it under the microscope, and there he saw a bacterium which had not been seen before. And he guessed that this bacterium was responsible. And he famously went back to the pump and he removed the handle off the Broad Street pump. The Broad Street cholera outbreak stopped overnight when he took off that handle. And it would be great if we could have a handle on the Broad Street pump for many of the collective threats to public health that we've been reviewing today. And my argument is that in many cases we do. We can address structure and not just agency. So this is Broad Street today and the location of where the Broad Street pump was. When it comes to accidents, we can think about roadway design. When it comes to smoking, we can think about how cigarettes are marketed. When it comes to firearms, we can think about gun availability. And when it comes to obesity, we can think about school lunches, soft drink machines in elementary schools, the design of our cities, and much else besides, not the least of which is our social norms. See you next time.